There is a moment that lives in the memory of anyone who watched professional football in the 1990s. It is January 29, 1995. The city of Miami is warm, the air heavy with the weight of something that has not yet happened but feels inevitable. Super Bowl 29 is underway at Joe Robbie Stadium, and Steve Young is standing behind the offensive line of the San Francisco 49ers, his left hand gripping the football with a certainty that has taken him more than a decade to find. The San Diego Chargers are across the line of scrimmage, and within the first 90 seconds of the game, Young drops back, surveys the field, and throws a touchdown pass to Jerry Rice. The stadium exhales. The broadcast booth hums with the familiar language of dominance. But what the cameras cannot capture, what no statistic will ever fully convey, is the quiet war happening inside the chest of the man throwing the football. This is not simply a quarterback playing well in a big game. This is a man who has carried the heaviest shadow in the history of the sport on his shoulders for nearly 7 years. A man who replaced the greatest quarterback many had ever seen. A man who heard the boos of his own fans in his own stadium. A man who was told again and again that he was not enough. And now, on the biggest stage the game has to offer, Steve Young is answering every doubt, every whisper, every cruel comparison with the most efficient and devastating performance a quarterback has ever delivered in a Super Bowl. He would throw 6 touchdown passes that evening. 6. No quarterback had ever done that before in the championship game. He would be named the most valuable player. He would weep on the sidelines in the final minutes, not from joy alone, but from the release of something that had been crushing him for so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. When the confetti fell and the trophy was lifted, Steve Young did not look like a man who had conquered the world. He looked like a man who had finally been set free. But to understand why that freedom meant so much, you have to understand the prison. You have to understand what it means to follow a legend. Not just any legend. Joe Montana, the man with 4 Super Bowl rings. The man with the coolest demeanor the game had ever seen. The man whose name was spoken like a prayer in San Francisco. Steve Young did not simply replace Joe Montana on the depth chart. He stepped into the longest, most public audition in the history of professional sports. And he did it knowing that no matter what he accomplished, there would always be someone in the stands, someone on the radio, someone at the dinner table who would shake their head and say he was not Joe. That is the story we are going to tell tonight. Not just the touchdowns, not just the scrambles and the left-handed spirals and the MVP trophies. We are going to walk through the life of a man who had every physical gift a quarterback could ask for and still had to fight for respect at every turn. A man who was so talented that 2 professional football leagues wanted him before he was 23 years old. A man who sat on the bench behind the most beloved player in franchise history and waited and waited and kept waiting and never stopped preparing. A man who, when his moment finally came, delivered at a level that silenced even his harshest critics. And a man who, in the end, had the game taken from him not by age or by a lack of desire, but by the accumulating toll of a violent sport on a body that had given everything it had. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Steve Young's story is not just a football story. It is a story about patience. It is a story about identity. It is a story about what happens when you are great, but the person who came before you was considered perfect. It is a story about the cost of proving yourself, and whether that cost is ever truly worth paying. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let us begin. To understand what Steve Young meant to the game of football, you first have to understand the position he played and how it evolved over the decades before he ever took a snap. The quarterback is the most scrutinized, most celebrated, most debated position in all of American professional sports. But it was not always that way. The quarterback as we know it today, the field general who reads defenses, audibilizes at the line, and delivers the football with precision to receivers running choreographed routes, that version of the position is a relatively modern invention. For much of football's early history, the quarterback was little more than a ball handler, a man who took the snap and handed it off to a running back or pitched it to a halfback on an option play. The forward pass existed, yes, but it was treated with suspicion by many coaches, seen as a risky novelty rather than a reliable weapon. In the 1920s and 1930s, the professional game was dominated by the ground attack. Teams like the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers built their identities around powerful running games, and the quarterback's primary job was to manage the flow of the offense without making mistakes. Passing was infrequent, and when it happened, it was often a desperation move on 3rd and long. The football itself was rounder and heavier, making it harder to throw with accuracy. The rules did not favor the passer. Defenders could hit receivers anywhere on the field at any time with almost no restrictions. It was a bruising, ground-based game, and the quarterback was not yet the star of the show. That began to change in the late 1930s and into the 1940s, largely because of a man named Sid Luckman, playing for the Chicago Bears under the legendary coach George Halas. Luckman became one of the first quarterbacks to demonstrate what the forward pass could do when wielded by someone with true arm talent and football intelligence. In 1943, Luckman threw 7 touchdown passes in a single game against the New York Giants, a record that stood for decades. He led the Bears to 4 championships and showed the football world that the passing game was not a gimmick. It was a weapon, but even Luckman operated within a system that relied heavily on the run. The T-formation offense that Halas popularized used the pass as a complement, not a foundation. The next great leap came in the 1950s, and it came from a man whose impact on the quarterback position cannot be overstated. Johnny Unitas arrived in Baltimore in 1956 after being cut by the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was picked up by the Colts almost as an afterthought, a young man from the sandlots of Pittsburgh who had been playing semi-professional football for $6 a game. Within 2 years, Unitas had transformed the position forever. He was the first quarterback to truly command the offense from the line of scrimmage, reading defenses before the snap, changing plays based on what he saw, and delivering the ball with a confidence and accuracy that the league had never witnessed at that level. His performance in the 1958 NFL Championship game, often called the greatest game ever played, introduced the quarterback as the central figure of professional football to a national television audience. Unitas stood in the pocket with the game on the line and drove the Colts down the field in the final minutes, and then again in overtime, with a calm precision that made him a household name. He would go on to set a record of 47 consecutive games with a touchdown pass, a mark that stood for more than 50 years. Unitas defined what it meant to be a pocket passer, a quarterback who stood tall behind the offensive line, surveyed the field, and delivered strikes with surgical accuracy. Through the 1960s and into the 70s, the pocket passer became the archetype. Joe Namath brought glamour and bravado to the position with the New York Jets, guaranteeing victory in Super Bowl III and delivering on that promise against the heavily favored Baltimore Colts. Roger Staubach combined pocket passing with occasional scrambling ability for the Dallas Cowboys, winning 2 Super Bowls and earning the nickname Captain America. Terry Bradshaw powered the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty of the 70s, with a cannon arm and a fearlessness in big moments, winning 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. Bob Grease quarterbacked the only perfect season in NFL history for the 1972 Miami Dolphins, managing the game with quiet efficiency while the running backs did the heavy lifting. Fran Tarkenton of the Minnesota Vikings was perhaps the first true scrambling quarterback in the modern era, frustrating defenses with his ability to escape the pocket and extend plays, though his Vikings never won a Super Bowl. Each of these men added something to the position, but the core identity remained the same. The great quarterback was a pocket passer first. He stood in the pocket. He read the defense. He threw the ball. Running was a last resort, not a feature. Then came the 1980s, and the position took another significant turn. This was the decade of 2 men who would become central to Steve Young's story, whether he wanted them to or not. Dan Marino of the Miami Dolphins redefined what was possible through the air. In 1984, his second year in the league, Marino threw for 5,084 yards and 48 touchdowns, numbers so outrageous that they were not matched for nearly 2 decades. He had the quickest release the game had ever seen, a compact, almost effortless motion that allowed him to get the ball out before pass rushers could reach him. Marino proved that a quarterback could build an entire offense around the pass, could win games almost single-handedly through the air without needing a dominant running game or even a great defense. He reached the Super Bowl in his second season, but never returned, a fact that would haunt his legacy forever, despite his individual brilliance. And then there was Joe Montana. If Marino was the pure passer, Montana was the artist. Playing for the San Francisco 49ers under the innovative coach Bill Walsh, Montana became the most successful quarterback of his generation and, in the eyes of many, the greatest to ever play the game. Walsh's West Coast offense was built on short, precise passes that functioned almost like an extension of the running game, moving the ball down the field in small, efficient chunks rather than through deep, high-risk throws. Montana was the perfect instrument for this system. He had an almost supernatural ability to read defenses, an internal clock that told him exactly when to release the ball, and a calm under pressure that bordered on the otherworldly. He won 4 Super Bowls. He was named the Super Bowl Most Valuable Player 3 times. He engineered the drive against the Cincinnati Bengals in Super Bowl 23, a 92-yard march in the final minutes that ended with a touchdown pass to John Taylor with 34 seconds remaining. He never threw an interception in a Super Bowl game. His passer rating in the Super Bowl remains one of the highest in history. Montana was not just great, he was perfect when it mattered most, and he did it all from the pocket, with a poised demeanor that earned him the nickname Joe Cool. This was the world that Steve Young entered, a world where the quarterback position was defined by pocket passers, a world where the scrambling quarterback was seen as a lesser breed, a player who ran because he could not throw well enough to beat you from the pocket. Fran Tarkenton had been exciting to watch, yes, but he never won the big one, and that fact was used as evidence by those who believed that running quarterbacks were entertaining but ultimately limited. The message from the football establishment was clear. If you wanted to win championships, you needed a pocket passer, you needed discipline, you needed someone who could stand in the pocket, take a hit, and deliver the ball. You did not need a quarterback who ran around like a halfback. Steve Young was left-handed. He could throw the ball with as much velocity and accuracy as anyone in the league, but he could also run, not just scramble to buy time, the way Staubach sometimes did, but genuinely run. He was fast, elusive, powerful, and willing to lower his shoulder and fight for extra yards. He was, in many ways, a prototype for a kind of quarterback that the league was not yet ready to fully embrace. He was a dual-threat quarterback in an era that did not yet have that term, in an era that viewed his running ability with equal parts admiration and suspicion. The position history matters because it frames the skepticism that followed Young throughout his career. When he ran, critics said he was not a real quarterback. When he scrambled out of the pocket, analysts questioned whether he could win from the pocket the way Montana did. When he took hits, coaches and commentators warned that his style of play would shorten his career. He was constantly measured against a standard, the pure pocket passer, that he did not fully embody, even though his passing numbers were extraordinary by any measure. What makes Young's place in quarterback history so fascinating is that he was ahead of his time. The modern NFL has fully embraced the mobile quarterback. Players who can both pass and run at an elite level are now considered the most valuable commodities in the sport. Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. These are quarterbacks whose ability to create with their legs is seen as a strength, not a liability. But in the 1980s and 90s, that view did not exist. Young was playing a style that would be celebrated decades later, but in his own era, it was a source of constant debate. The evolution of the quarterback position is really a story about the evolution of football itself. From the ground game of the 20s and 30s, to the pocket passing revolution of the 50s and 60s, to the aerial explosion of the 80s, each era redefined what a quarterback was supposed to be. And in every era, there were players who did not fit the mold, who played the position differently, who were judged not on their results but on their style. Steve Young was one of those players. He could do things that no other quarterback in the league could do, but the very abilities that made him special were the same abilities that made people question whether he was truly elite. There is something deeply human about that tension. The idea that your greatest gifts can also be the source of your greatest doubts. The idea that the very thing that sets you apart can be used against you. Steve Young lived that tension for his entire career. He was too talented to ignore, too gifted to bench, and too different to fully accept. He was a left-handed quarterback in a right-handed world, a running quarterback in a passing era, and a brilliant player standing in the shadow of a man who was considered perfect. The history of the position created the framework through which Young would be judged, and that framework, for most of his career, was tilted against him. But the deeper story, the one that matters most, is not about framework or position history or football strategy. It is about the man himself, where he came from, what he endured, and how he found a way to become not just good enough, but one of the greatest to ever play the position he helped redefine. That story begins in a small town in Connecticut, in a family with roots that stretched back to the earliest days of the American frontier, with a boy who threw left-handed spirals in the backyard and dreamed of a future he could not yet see. John Stephen Young was born on October 11, 1961, in Salt Lake City, Utah, but he grew up primarily in Greenwich, Connecticut, a wealthy suburb of New York City, known for its manicured lawns, its private schools, and its proximity to the financial centers of the Eastern Seaboard. His family had deep roots in American history. Steve was a great-great-great-grandson of Brigham Young, the prominent leader who led settlers to the Piata Territory in the 19th century. It was a lineage that carried weight and expectation, though Steve would later say that the family connection was more a source of curiosity than pressure. His father, LeGrande Young, known as Grit, had been a football player himself, a running back at Brigham Young University. His mother, Sherry, was devoted to the family, and the Young household was one of discipline, faith, and a quiet but persistent competitiveness. Steve was the oldest of 5 children, and from an early age, he displayed an athletic ability that went beyond what was typical, even in a sports-oriented family. He was fast, he was coordinated, he could throw a football with his left hand in a way that seemed effortless, the ball spinning in a tight spiral that belied his age. But what set him apart even more than his physical tools was his intensity. Steve Young did not simply play sports. He attacked them with a ferocity and a focus that his parents sometimes found concerning. He hated to lose, not in the casual way that most competitive children hate to lose, but in a deep, almost existential way. A loss in a backyard game could send him into hours of brooding silence. A bad play in an organized game could consume him for days. This was not mere competitiveness. This was something closer to perfectionism, a trait that would define his career and at times torment him. At Greenwich High School, Young was a multi-sport star. He played football, basketball, and baseball, excelling in all 3. On the football field, he was the quarterback, and he was spectacular. His junior and senior seasons drew the attention of college recruiters from across the country. He could throw the ball deep with accuracy. He could scramble out of trouble and turn broken plays into long gains, and he had an instinct for the game that coaches recognized as rare. By the time he graduated, he had scholarship offers from multiple programs. He chose Brigham Young University, the school where his father had played, the school named for his famous ancestor. It felt like a homecoming, though Steve had never lived in Utah for any extended period. At BYU, Young's early years were challenging. He arrived on campus in 1980 and found himself buried on the depth chart behind Jim McMahon, a brash, talented quarterback who would go on to lead the Chicago Bears to a Super Bowl championship. McMahon was everything Young was not in terms of personality. Loud, rebellious, supremely confident in a way that bordered on arrogance. Young, by contrast, was quiet, anxious, and deeply unsure of himself despite his obvious talent. He watched from the sideline as McMahon lit up opposing defenses, and he wondered whether he would ever get his chance. When McMahon graduated and moved on to the NFL, Young became the starter, and he was brilliant. In the 1983 season, he threw for 3,902 yards and 33 touchdowns. He completed over 63% of his passes. He led BYU to an 11-1 record and a Holiday Bowl victory. His performance was so dominant that he finished second in the Heisman Trophy voting, the award given to the best player in college football. He was, by virtually every measure, the best quarterback in college football that year. But even amid this success, the anxiety never left him. Young would later speak openly about the intense pressure he felt, not from coaches or fans, but from within himself. He was terrified of failure. He would sometimes become physically ill before games, his stomach twisting with nerves that no amount of talent could quiet. He set impossibly high standards for himself, and then punished himself mentally when he fell short. It was a cycle that would follow him into the professional ranks and intensify under the spotlight of the NFL. When the 1984 draft season arrived, Young was one of the most coveted quarterback prospects in the country. But the NFL was not the only professional football league in America at that time. The United States Football League, the USFL, had launched in 1983 as a spring league designed to compete with the NFL for talent. The USFL teams had deep-pocketed owners who were willing to pay enormous salaries to lure top college players away from the established league. The Los Angeles Express of the USFL offered Young a contract that was staggering in its scope. A reported $40 million deal spread over more than 40 years, with a significant portion of the money deferred. The numbers were unprecedented for any football player in any league. The NFL's Cincinnati Bengals had selected Young with the first pick of the 1984 supplemental draft. But they could not come close to matching the USFL's offer. Young signed with the Express. It was a decision driven partly by money, partly by the desire to play immediately rather than potentially sitting behind a veteran in the NFL, and partly by the advice of his agent at the time. But the USFL experience was a disaster. The Express were a poorly run organization playing in a league that was hemorrhaging money. The team's ownership group struggled to meet payroll. The coaching staff was unstable. The roster was thin. Young was sacked frequently behind a porous offensive line, and the losing took a severe toll on his mental state. He later described his time with the Express as one of the lowest points of his life. He was a gifted young quarterback, trapped in a dying league, taking a physical beating week after week, and wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake. The USFL folded after the 1985 season, its dream of competing with the NFL undone by financial mismanagement and a disastrous antitrust lawsuit. Young was now free to enter the NFL, but the circumstances were not what he had hoped. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers acquired his rights and signed him. Tampa Bay in the mid-1980s was one of the worst franchises in professional football. The Buccaneers had won just 2 games in the 1985 season and were mired in a culture of losing that seemed almost impossible to escape. Young was asked to be the franchise savior, but he had almost nothing to work with. The offensive line was weak, the receivers were mediocre, the coaching was inconsistent, the defense could not stop anyone. In 2 seasons with Tampa Bay, Young's record as a starter was 3 wins and 16 losses. His statistics were poor. He threw more interceptions than touchdowns in his time with the Buccaneers. He was sacked repeatedly, hit constantly, and demoralized thoroughly. The anxiety that had always simmered within him reached a boiling point. He was so miserable in Tampa that he considered quitting football entirely. He would later tell interviewers that he drove to the airport after one particularly brutal loss and seriously contemplated getting on a plane and never coming back. And it gets harder, because it was not just the losing that ate at him, it was the loneliness. Young was a private person in a very public profession, a devout man of faith in a locker room culture that did not always understand him, and a deeply sensitive soul in a sport that rewarded toughness above all else. He did not fit in Tampa Bay, not on the field and not off it. He was miserable, and everyone around him could see it. Then, in the spring of 1987, a trade changed everything. The San Francisco 49ers, the defending champions of the football world, acquired Steve Young from the Buccaneers in exchange for 2nd and 4th round draft picks. It was Bill Walsh, the genius head coach, who orchestrated the deal. Walsh saw something in Young that Tampa Bay had failed to develop. He saw a quarterback with elite arm talent, extraordinary athletic ability, and a football intelligence that was being wasted in a broken system. Walsh believed that if Young could be placed in the right environment, with the right coaching and the right supporting cast, he could be something special. But there was a complication, a significant one. The starting quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers was Joe Montana, the greatest quarterback in franchise history, the man with 3 Super Bowl rings at that point, with a 4th to come, the most popular athlete in the Bay Area and arguably the most revered player in the entire sport. Young had not been brought to San Francisco to replace Montana. He had been brought to back him up, and that is precisely what he did. For years, from 1987 through 1991, Steve Young sat behind Joe Montana. He played when Montana was injured, which happened with increasing frequency as Montana aged, and his body absorbed the accumulated damage of more than a decade of professional football. When Young played, he was often brilliant. In 1987, he posted the highest passer rating in the NFL, despite being a backup who only started in the games affected by the players' strike and a handful of others. In 1991, when Montana missed the entire season due to an elbow injury, Young stepped in and played at an all-pro level, leading the 49ers to a strong regular seasons before a heartbreaking loss to the Dallas Cowboys in the NFC Championship game. But no matter how well he played, the Montana shadow was always there. The fans in San Francisco were fiercely loyal to Montana. They booed Young when he took the field, even in games where Montana was injured and Young was the only option. They wore Montana jerseys to the stadium. They called into radio shows to demand that Montana be reinstated as the starter. The local media was divided, but often leaned toward Montana, framing the quarterback controversy as a test of loyalty to the franchise's greatest hero. Young was the outsider, the interloper, the man who was trying to take something that did not belong to him. It did not matter that he was playing well. It did not matter that he was doing everything the coaches asked. In the eyes of many fans, he was guilty of the unforgivable sin of not being Joe Montana. The emotional toll was enormous. Young later described those years as the most difficult of his professional life, worse even than Tampa Bay, because in Tampa he had been losing and miserable, but at least he had been the starter, the guy the team was counting on. In San Francisco, he was winning and still being rejected. He could play a near-perfect game and still hear boos ringing in his ears as he walked off the field. He could throw 4 touchdown passes and still read columns the next morning about how Montana would have thrown 5. The comparison was constant, relentless, and, in Young's mind, impossible to escape. In 1993, the 49ers made the decision that had been building for years. Montana was traded to the Kansas City Chiefs. The job was Steve Young's. Fully, completely, without qualification. He was 31 years old. He had been in professional football for nearly a decade. He had endured the USFL, the nightmare of Tampa Bay, and 5 years of sitting behind a legend. And now, finally, the stage was his. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The shadow did not leave when Montana did. In many ways, it only deepened. The first great test of Steve Young's reign as the undisputed starting quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers came not in a Super Bowl or a playoff game, but in the court of public opinion during the 1993 regular season. Montana was gone, traded to Kansas City, and the 49ers were now officially Steve Young's team. The roster was loaded with talent. Jerry Rice, the greatest wide receiver in football history, was in his prime. The offensive line was solid. The defense, while not dominant, was competent. The West Coast offense, refined over more than a decade, was a machine that Young knew intimately after years of studying it from the sideline. On paper, the 49ers should have been among the best teams in football. And they were. Young posted spectacular numbers that season. He threw for 3,969 yards and 29 touchdowns against just 16 interceptions. His passer rating was over 101, among the highest in the league. He added 407 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, numbers that no other quarterback in the league could match. He was named to the Pro Bowl. By any objective measure, it was an elite season. But the season ended in the NFC Championship game, a loss to the Dallas Cowboys by a score of 38-21. It was the second consecutive year that the Cowboys had ended San Francisco's season in the conference championship. Dallas, led by Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, and Michael Irvin, was the dominant team of the early 90s, and they had San Francisco's number. The loss was crushing, but it was made worse by the narrative that immediately attached to it. Montana, the critics pointed out, had never lost an NFC championship game at home. Montana had won 4 Super Bowls. Montana would have found a way. The comparisons were brutal, and Young absorbed them like body blows. He could see the numbers on his stat sheet. He knew he had played well throughout the season. But the only number that mattered was 0, and that was the number of championships he had won as a starter. The 1994 season began with a quiet determination that those close to Young could feel, but that he rarely expressed publicly. He was 32 years old. He had been a professional football player for more than a decade. He had earned enormous sums of money, won individual awards, and established himself statistically as one of the finest quarterbacks in the game. But none of that mattered to him or to his critics without a championship. The absence of a Super Bowl ring was the hole in his resume, the missing piece that allowed the Montana comparison to persist. Young knew it, his teammates knew it, his coaches knew it, the entire franchise knew it. Everything in the 1994 season was oriented toward one goal: winning the Super Bowl. The regular season was a masterpiece. Young completed 64.3% of his passes for 3,969 yards. He threw 35 touchdown passes against just 10 interceptions. His passer rating was a staggering 112.8, the highest in the NFL that year, and one of the highest single-season marks in league history at that time. He rushed for 293 yards and 7 touchdowns. He was named the NFL's most valuable player for the first time in his career. The 49ers finished the regular season with a record of 13 wins and 3 losses, earning home field advantage throughout the NFC playoffs. The numbers are striking when you examine them in context. Young's 35 touchdown passes led the league. His passer rating was nearly 20 points higher than the second-best quarterback in football. He was not just good, he was operating at a level that the league had rarely seen from any quarterback in any era. And he was doing it not as a pure pocket passer in the Montana mold, but as a player who combined elite passing with a running ability that defenses simply could not account for. When the pocket collapsed, Young did not just dump the ball off or throw it away. He took off, he ran, he created, he improvised. And more often than not, he turned potential disasters into first downs or touchdowns. It was a style of play that was exhausting to watch because you knew that every time he tucked the ball and ran, he was exposing himself to hits that other quarterbacks avoided. But it was also electrifying because no one else in the league could do what he did. The NFC Championship game that year was a rematch with the Dallas Cowboys, the team that had eliminated San Francisco in each of the 2 previous seasons. The game was at Candlestick Park, the aging, windswept stadium by the bay that had been home to the 49ers for decades. The atmosphere was charged with desperation. The fans knew that this was the moment. If Young could not beat Dallas at home, if the Cowboys eliminated San Francisco for a 3rd consecutive year, the Montana narrative would become permanent. Young would be the quarterback who could not win the big one, the man who had all the talent but lacked whatever intangible quality Montana possessed that allowed him to rise to the occasion when the stakes were highest. The game was tight in the early going. Dallas scored first, and the stadium went quiet with a familiar dread, but Young responded. He led scoring drives with a combination of sharp passing and clutch scrambles. The 49ers defense, bolstered by key off-season additions, including cornerback Deion Sanders, played its best game of the year. The Niners took control in the second half and pulled away, winning 38-28. Young was superb, throwing for 2 touchdowns and running for another. He had slain the dragon. He had beaten the Cowboys. He had advanced to the Super Bowl for the first time as a starting quarterback. The 2 weeks between the NFC Championship game and Super Bowl 29 were, by all accounts, among the most intense of Young's life. He was restless, he was anxious, he could not sleep. The magnitude of the moment pressed down on him with a force that even he, a man accustomed to pressure found difficult to manage. He had waited so long for this, the USFL, Tampa Bay, the bench behind Montana, the booze, the losses to Dallas. It had all led to this. One game, one chance. If he won, the narrative changed forever. If he lost, the Montana shadow might never lift. Super Bowl 29 was played on January 29, 1995, at Joe Robbie Stadium in Miami. The San Francisco 49ers faced the San Diego Chargers, who had earned their first Super Bowl appearance in franchise history. The Chargers were a good team, led by quarterback Stan Humphries and a defense anchored by linebacker Junior So, but they were significant underdogs. The 49ers were considered by many to be one of the most talented teams ever assembled, and the oddsmakers agreed, installing San Francisco as an 18.5-point favorite, one of the largest point spreads in Super Bowl history. What followed was not merely a victory, it was an annihilation. Young came out throwing and never stopped. On the third play of the game, he hit Jerry Rice on a 44-yard touchdown pass. It took less than 90 seconds. Before the first quarter was over, San Francisco led 14-0. By halftime, the score was 28-10. Young was in a zone that transcended normal performance. His throws were precise, his reads were instant, his movements in the pocket were fluid. When the pocket broke down, he ran, picking up critical first downs and keeping drives alive. He threw touchdown passes to Rice, to Ricky Watters, to fullback William Floyd, each one a dagger that pushed the game further beyond the Chargers' reach. The final score was 49-26. Young completed 24 of 36 passes for 325 yards and 6 touchdown passes. 6. It was a Super Bowl record. No quarterback had ever thrown that many touchdown passes in the championship game. His passer rating for the game was 134.8. He was named the Super Bowl Most Valuable Player by unanimous acclaim. The 49ers' 49 points set a Super Bowl scoring record. It was, by many measures, the most dominant quarterbacking performance in Super Bowl history. And then came the moment that everyone remembers. As the final seconds ticked away and the outcome was beyond doubt, the camera found Steve Young on the sideline. He was not celebrating with the cool detachment of Joe Montana. He was weeping. His eyes were red, his face was contorted, and he was shouting something to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. The words, captured by the sideline microphones, have become part of football lore. He screamed about the weight being lifted, about the monkey being off his back, about finally doing it. It was raw. It was unscripted. It was the release of years of accumulated pressure, doubt, and pain, all pouring out in a single, uncontrollable flood of emotion. Some viewers found it beautiful. Others found it uncomfortable. But no one who watched it could deny its authenticity. This was not a man performing for the cameras. This was a man whose soul had been squeezed for so long that when the pressure finally released, he could not contain what came out. The years following the Super Bowl victory should have been a victory lap, a period of sustained excellence, free from the shadow of Montana and the burden of championship expectations. And in many ways, Young did continue to play at an extraordinary level. In 1995, he threw for 3,200 yards and 20 touchdowns, though the season was shortened by a shoulder injury. In 1996, he returned healthy and led the league in passer rating for the 6th time in his career, throwing for 3,410 yards with a league-best passer rating of 97.2. He made the Pro Bowl again. He was, statistically, one of the 2 or 3 best quarterbacks in football every single season. But the 49ers as a team were declining. The roster that had been so dominant in 1994 was aging and being dismantled by the salary cap, which had been introduced in 1994 and was forcing teams to make difficult personnel decisions. Key players left in free agency. Draft picks did not develop as hoped. The defense, which had been the crucial complement to the explosive offense, grew weaker each year. The NFC was also changing. The Green Bay Packers, led by Brett Favre, had emerged as the dominant team in the conference. The Cowboys, though fading, were still dangerous. The 49ers were no longer the class of the league, and Young, despite his individual brilliance, could not carry the team by himself. The 1997 season illustrated the frustration perfectly. Young played well, throwing for 4,017 yards and 19 touchdowns. He led the 49ers to a 13-3 record and the top seed in the NFC playoffs. But in the NFC Championship game, the Niners fell to the Packers in Green Bay. Young was solid but not spectacular, and the defense could not contain Favre and the Packers' balanced attack. It was another heartbreaking end to a season, another year that fell short of the ultimate goal. Young had his Super Bowl ring, yes, but the competitive fire that drove him demanded more. He wanted to prove that he could sustain a dynasty the way Montana had, that he could win multiple championships and establish a legacy that stood on its own terms, not in comparison to anyone else. The 1998 season brought a new head coach, Steve Mariucci, and a renewed sense of optimism. Young threw for 36 touchdowns that year, the most of his career, and added 6 rushing touchdowns. His passer rating was over 101. The 49ers went 12-4 and earned a first-round bye in the playoffs. In the divisional round, they faced the Packers at Candlestick Park in a game that is still remembered as one of the great playoff contests of the decade. The 49ers trailed by a touchdown in the final minutes, but Young led a stunning drive that culminated in a 25-yard touchdown pass to Terrell Owens, a young receiver who had struggled with dropped passes throughout the game. Owens caught the ball in traffic with 3 seconds remaining, and San Francisco won by a single point. Young leaped into the arms of his teammates, the stadium erupting in pandemonium. It was one of the finest moments of his career, a clutch drive that rivaled anything Montana had ever produced. But the next week, the 49ers lost to the Atlanta Falcons in the divisional round. The season was over. Young was 37 years old, and the window was closing. He could feel it, not just in the aging roster around him, but in his own body. He had been playing professional football for 15 years, taking hits that would have destroyed lesser men. His style of play, the scrambling, the willingness to absorb contact, the refusal to slide, had taken a cumulative toll that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. And then came the moment that changed everything. September 27, 1999, a Monday night game against the Arizona Cardinals. Young dropped back to pass and was hit by a blitzing cornerback named Aeneas Williams. The hit was devastating. Young's head struck the ground with violent force, and he lay on the turf for an agonizing period, clearly dazed, clearly hurt. It was his 7th documented concussion. 7. The medical staff helped him off the field, and as he walked toward the tunnel, there was a sense of finality in the stadium that no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone could feel. The game continued. The season continued. But Steve Young never played another down of professional football. The concussions had accumulated to a point where the risk of continued play was simply too great. Doctors advised him to retire. His family pleaded with him to stop. Young resisted at first, spending the entire 2000 season on injured reserve, hoping that the symptoms would subside and he could return. They did not. He formally announced his retirement in June of 1999, though he would not officially walk away until the following year. It was a cruel ending for a man who had worked so hard and waited so long for his moment. He had reached the pinnacle, yes. He had won his Super Bowl, silenced the doubters, proven that he belonged alongside the greatest who had ever played. But the game took something from him in return. It took his ability to play the sport he loved. It took the final chapters that might have been written. It took the chance to build on the championship and establish the multi-ring legacy that he craved. Steve Young's career did not end with a triumphant final game, a storybook walk-off into the sunset. It ended with a hit on a Monday night in September, a slow walk to the tunnel, and a long silence that would stretch into the rest of his life. The conversation about Steve Young almost always begins with football. The left-handed spirals, the scrambles, the Super Bowl, the Montana comparison. These are the frames through which the world understood him, and they are not wrong. But they are incomplete, because the deeper truth about Steve Young is that the man behind the helmet was fighting battles that had nothing to do with cornerbacks or defensive schemes. He was fighting himself. Young has spoken candidly in the years since his retirement about the anxiety and obsessive perfectionism that defined his inner life from childhood onward. This was not the garden variety nervousness. that every professional athlete feels before a big game. This was something more persistent, more corrosive, more difficult to manage. He would lie awake at night, replaying every mistake from a game, not for a few minutes but for hours, his mind locked in a loop of self-criticism that he could not break. He would arrive at the facility the next morning exhausted, not from physical exertion, but from the relentless churn of his own thoughts. He set standards for himself that were, by his own later admission, impossible to meet, and then he treated every failure to meet those standards as evidence of a fundamental inadequacy. Let that sink in. Here was a man who was one of the 5 or 10 best football players on the planet. A man who was setting records and winning awards and earning tens of millions of dollars, and he could not quiet the voice in his head that told him he was not good enough. The external validation meant nothing. The Pro Bowl selections, the passer ratings, the touchdown passes, they were numbers on a page, accomplishments that the world celebrated, but that his internal critic dismissed as insufficient. He was trapped in a cycle where achievement did not bring satisfaction, only a brief respite before the next wave of self-doubt crashed over him. The anxiety was compounded by the Montana situation. Young has described the experience of being booed in his own stadium as one of the most painful things he has ever endured. Not because the boos hurt his ego, though they surely did, but because they confirmed the fear that already lived inside him. The fear that he was an imposter. The fear that no matter how well he played, he would never be accepted. The fear that the people who mattered most, the fans, the city, the football community, would always see him as the second choice, the replacement, the man who was filling a role that belonged to someone else. When the fans booed, they were not just expressing a preference for Montana. They were, in Young's mind, validating every insecure thought he had ever had about himself. Let that sink in. A Hall of Fame quarterback, a Super Bowl champion, a man whose name belongs on any list of the greatest to ever play the position, spent years of his career believing that he was not wanted. Not because the evidence supported that belief, but because his own psychology could not process the evidence in any other way. The loneliness was another dimension of the deeper truth. Young was a private man in one of the most public professions in America. He was a devout member of his faith in a locker room culture that often ran counter to those values. He was not married during his playing years, and in a sport where players' personal lives were often conducted in public, Young's bachelor status became a topic of constant speculation and, at times, mean-spirited gossip. He dated, but he kept his personal life carefully guarded, which only fueled the rumors. None of this was anyone's business, of course, but the fishbowl of professional sports does not respect boundaries. Young navigated this with as much grace as he could, but the scrutiny added another layer of stress to a life that was already burdened with more than its share. The physical toll was perhaps the most tangible cost. Young's style of play, the scrambling, the refusal to go down easily, the willingness to take hits that other quarterbacks avoided, made him one of the most exciting players in the league. But it also made him one of the most vulnerable. Over the course of his career, he suffered multiple concussions, each one a reminder that the body has limits, and that those limits, once exceeded, do not reset. The 1999 concussion against the Cardinals was the one that ended his career, but it was not the first or even the second or the third. By the time Williams hit him on that Monday night, Young's brain had already absorbed an extraordinary amount of trauma. The retirement was not a choice made freely. It was a choice made under the weight of medical evidence that could not be ignored. In the years since his retirement, the conversation around brain injuries in football has changed dramatically. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, the degenerative brain disease linked to repeated head trauma, has become one of the most important and troubling issues in the sport. Former players have been diagnosed with the condition after their deaths, and the stories of cognitive decline, mood disturbances, and behavioral changes have cast a long shadow over the game. Young has been open about his concerns. He has spoken about the headaches, the memory issues, the lingering effects of a career spent absorbing violent collisions. He has been tested regularly and has been an advocate for player safety, pushing for rule changes and improved protocols that protect current players from the kind of damage that ended his career. The deeper truth about Steve Young is that his story is not just about what he accomplished on the field. It is about what the field took from him. It is about the price of greatness in a sport that is, by its nature, destructive. He gave everything he had to football: his body, his mental health, his 20s and 30s. Years of his life spent in emotional turmoil, fighting for acceptance, fighting for championships, fighting against himself. And in the end, the game said, "That is enough. You have given enough." And it took away his ability to play before he was ready to stop. After retirement, Young built a life that was rich and full in ways that his playing career had sometimes prevented. He married his wife, Barbara Graham, in 2000, just a year after his final game. They would go on to have 3 children together. He pursued business interests in private equity and venture capital, applying the same intelligence and competitiveness that had made him a great quarterback to the world of finance. He earned a law degree from Brigham Young University's law school, a remarkable achievement for a man who had spent his adult life on football fields rather than in classrooms. He became a television analyst, first for ESPN and later for other networks, offering insights into the game with a perspective that was informed by both his brilliance and his suffering. He also became an advocate for player safety, for mental health awareness, for the idea that athletes are not just bodies to be used and discarded, but human beings with rich inner lives and complex emotional needs. He spoke openly about his anxiety at a time when male athletes almost never discussed mental health. He talked about therapy, about coping strategies, about the importance of seeking help when the internal pressure becomes too great. In doing so, he gave permission to others, not just athletes, but people in all walks of life, to acknowledge their own struggles without shame. The truth about Steve Young is that his greatest accomplishment may not be the Super Bowl ring, or the 6 touchdown passes, or the NFL records. It may be the way he has lived his life after the final whistle, the way he has used his platform to normalize vulnerability and to challenge the idea that toughness means silence in the face of suffering. When the Pro Football Hall of Fame inducted Steve Young in 2005, he stood at the podium in Canton, Ohio, and delivered a speech that was, in many ways, a perfect encapsulation of the man himself. It was emotional but measured. It was grateful but honest. He thanked the people who had believed in him, from his parents to Bill Walsh to his teammates, and he acknowledged the pain that had accompanied the glory. He did not pretend that the journey had been easy. He did not reduce his career to a highlight reel. He stood before the assembled crowd and told the truth, which is that the path from the USFL to the Super Bowl had been long, lonely, and often agonizing, and that the destination, for all its splendor, had not erased the scars of the journey. Young's career statistics are remarkable by any standard. He finished with 33,228 passing yards and 232 touchdown passes. He rushed for 4,239 yards and 43 touchdowns. Numbers that would be impressive for a running back, let alone a quarterback. His career passer rating of 96.8 was the highest in NFL history at the time of his retirement, a record that stood for years. He led the league in passer rating 6 times, more than any other quarterback in history. He was selected to 7 Pro Bowls. He won 3 Super Bowls with the 49ers, 1 as the starter and 2 as Montana's backup. He was the NFL's most valuable player in 1992 and 1994. But numbers, as Young himself would likely tell you, do not capture the essence of what he was. Numbers do not convey the sight of a left-handed quarterback rolling to his right, buying time with his legs, then planting and throwing a strike across his body to a receiver who had broken open in the secondary. Numbers do not capture the electricity that filled a stadium when Young tucked the ball under his arm and took off running, his feet moving with a quickness that seems impossible for a man of his size. Defenders grasping air as he slid past them and picked up first downs that no other quarterback would have attempted. Numbers do not capture the quiet determination on his face as he walked onto the field for the 1,000th time with the ghost of Joe Montana standing just behind him, invisible to everyone else, but impossibly real to him. Young's legacy exists on multiple levels. On the simplest level, he is remembered as one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. His combination of passing and running ability was unmatched in his era and remains among the most impressive in league history. He could beat you from the pocket, the way the football establishment demanded, and he could beat you on the run, the way his instincts preferred. He was, in every meaningful sense, a complete quarterback. On a deeper level, Young is remembered as a man who proved that patience and perseverance can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. His career is a testament to the idea that greatness is not always recognized immediately, that the path to fulfillment is not always direct, and that the ability to endure rejection and doubt is as important as the ability to throw a football. He sat on the bench for years behind the greatest quarterback of his generation. He was booed by his own fans. He lost championships. He suffered through terrible teams and terrible leagues. And through all of it, he kept working, kept preparing, kept believing that his moment would come. When it did, he was ready. That is a story with resonance far beyond the football field. On the deepest level, Young's legacy is about the cost of excellence. He gave everything he had to the game, and the game took everything it could in return. His concussions ended his career prematurely. His anxiety made the journey far more painful than it needed to be. His perfectionism drove him to greatness, but also drove him to despair. He is a reminder that the athletes we celebrate on Sundays are not just performers. They are human beings with fears and doubts and vulnerabilities, and the entertainment we enjoy comes at a price that we rarely see and too often ignore. The era that Steve Young represented, the 1990s, feels like a different world now. The game has changed in ways that would be almost unrecognizable to the players of that decade. The rules have been altered to protect quarterbacks and receivers. The salary cap has created a parity that makes dynasties harder to build. The analytics revolution has transformed how teams evaluate players and make decisions. The West Coast offense, the system that Bill Walsh built and that Young mastered, has evolved into something broader and more complex. Its principles absorbed into virtually every offensive scheme in the modern game. But some things do not change. The pressure on quarterbacks to perform, the weight of expectations that comes with following a legend, the physical toll of playing a violent sport at the highest level, the internal battles that no one sees. These are constants, as true today as they were in Steve Young's time. And it is because of this that his story continues to resonate, not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a living, breathing testament to the human experience within the world of professional football. There is a photograph that was taken on the sideline during the final minutes of Super Bowl 29. Steve Young is standing with his helmet in one hand, his other hand on his hip, and his face is a landscape of emotions too complex to name. There is joy in that face, yes, but there is also something else. Something that looks like disbelief, something that looks like exhaustion, something that looks like the quiet aftermath of a storm that has finally passed. He has just thrown 6 touchdown passes in the Super Bowl. He has just won the championship that he has been chasing for more than a decade. He has just silenced every critic who ever said he was not good enough. And in that moment, he does not look like a conqueror. He looks like a survivor. That is the word that best captures the essence of Steve Young's story. Survivor. He survived the USFL. He survived Tampa Bay. He survived the bench behind Joe Montana. He survived the boos and the comparisons and the crushing weight of expectations that would have broken most men. He survived the anxiety that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat, always present, always reminding him that the next failure was just one play away. He survived 7 concussions and the medical reality that his brain could not withstand another one. He survived all of it, and he emerged on the other side not broken, but whole. Changed, certainly. Scarred, without question. But whole. Steve Young was not the most celebrated quarterback of his era. That title belonged to the man who came before him. The man whose shadow he could never fully escape, no matter how many touchdowns he threw, or how many records he set. He was not the most naturally gifted passer of his generation. Dan Marino and John Elway could make throws that defied physics. He was not the most charismatic, or the most quotable, or the most marketable. He was, in many ways, the least likely legend, a man whose greatness was built not on grace or ease but on struggle and endurance. And perhaps that is why his story matters so much. Because most people do not live lives of grace and ease. Most people know what it feels like to be compared to someone else and found wanting. Most people know what it feels like to work harder than they thought possible and still fall short. Most people know what it feels like to wait for a chance, to sit on the bench, to be told that their moment has not yet arrived. Steve Young's story is a mirror, and in it, millions of people see their own struggles reflected back at them, dignified by the fact that even a Hall of Fame quarterback had to endure the same doubts and fears that they face every day. The left-handed spirals that Steve Young threw into the California sky are gone now, dissolved into the atmosphere like every other football ever thrown in anger or in practice. The stadiums where he played have been replaced or renovated. The teammates who blocked for him and caught his passes have retired and moved on to second careers and quiet lives. The coaches who shaped him have passed on or faded from the public eye. The era in which he played feels distant, separated from the present by technological change and cultural evolution and the relentless forward motion of time. But the essence of the story remains. A boy from Connecticut who threw left-handed spirals in the backyard. A young man who chose the wrong league and then the wrong team before finding the right one. A backup who waited and kept waiting. A starter who was booed by his own fans. A champion who wept on the sideline because the weight of the moment was too heavy to bear in silence. A man whose career was cut short by the accumulated violence of the game he loved. A husband and father who found peace in the life that followed football. A voice for the vulnerable, for the anxious, for the ones who are told they are not enough. Steve Young was a left-handed genius who followed a legend. He lived in that shadow for so long that some people thought it would consume him. It did not. He stepped into the light, and when he did, the light was blinding. Not because of the Super Bowl ring, or the records, or the Hall of Fame bust, but because of the human truth at the center of it all. That the measure of a life is not what you achieve when the path is easy, but what you become when the path is impossible. He became Steve Young, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.